Hey there, traveler. I'm glad you're here tonight. The fire's warm, the night is quiet, and we're about to take a slow walk back in time, to the frozen plains of the American West. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when the wild lands of America were ruled by cold, hunger, and silence. No highways, no cities, no heaters humming softly in the dark. Just wind, endless wind, sweeping over miles of snow-covered prairie. And yet, people lived there. Families, trappers, ranchers, gold seekers, even whole wagon trains full of dreamers moving west. They faced winters that could drop below -30 degrees, with nothing but wood smoke and hope to keep them alive. Tonight, we're not talking about gunfights, gold rushes, or train robberies. This story is about something much quieter, but far more human. How ordinary people managed to sleep through brutal winters in a world that felt like it wanted to freeze them where they stood. Let's start by picturing it together. The year might be 1875. The place, somewhere in the Dakota Territory. The land stretches for miles, white and endless, with only a few lonely cabins scattered far apart. Inside one of those cabins, a small fire flickers weakly in an iron stove. The air smells of pine smoke and wool blankets. You can hear the wind outside, not just a gentle breeze, but a steady moaning sound that never quite stops. The walls creak, the roof shifts, and yet somehow inside people are sleeping. But it wasn't easy. Back then, most settlers didn't have thick insulation or glass windows. Many homes were made of logs stacked with gaps filled by mud or clay. Some, called sod houses, were literally built from blocks of earth. They kept out the worst of the wind, but not all of it. When the fire died down, you could sometimes see your own breath, even under the blankets. So how did they manage? They layered everything: feather beds, quilts, fur pelts, even old coats and sacks stuffed with hay. Sometimes families would all sleep in the same bed to share body heat. Parents in the middle, children tucked close on the sides, wrapped so tight it was hard to move. For travelers on the trail, it was rougher still. A cowboy might wrap himself in a buffalo hide and curl up near his horse for warmth. If he was lucky, he'd have a campfire. If not, he'd dig a small hollow in the snow, crawl inside, and hope to wake up in the morning. People became inventive with what they had. Some used hot stones or coals wrapped in cloth as makeshift heaters. Others placed bottles filled with boiled water at their feet before bed. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival. Still, there was a kind of peace in it, too. The world slowed down in winter. Nights were long, and time felt softer, like the snow itself. Inside those cabins, people told stories, read by candlelight, or listened to the crackle of the fire. It was a simple rhythm. Eat, warm the stove, wrap up, sleep, and in that simplicity, maybe they found something we've lost, the feeling of being completely in tune with the natural world. They didn't fight the cold, they lived with it, respected it, endured it. Out on the prairie, silence could stretch for days. No engines, no hums, no street lamps. Just the wind, the snow, and the slow sound of breathing under layers of blankets. And somehow, through all that, they dreamed. Maybe of spring, maybe of home, or maybe just of waking to another sunrise. That's how it began. The long, cold nights of the frontier. The world outside frozen and merciless, and inside the faint, flickering warmth of human resilience. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that same quiet warmth, the firelight fading, the snow falling outside, the wind singing its low, endless song. You're safe inside, wrapped in wool and memory, as the Wild West drifts deeper into sleep. The wind outside never really stops. Out on the prairie or deep in the mountain valleys, it howls like a living thing, steady, lonely, and cold enough to bite through any crack in the wall. But inside a frontier cabin, life carried on. These homes weren't big, maybe just one room for an entire family. The floor was often dirt, the windows, if there were any, small and covered with oiled paper instead of glass. The smell inside was a mix of smoke, stew, and damp wool. At night, everything revolved around warmth. When the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast, and every task became part of a silent ritual. Banking the fire, checking the stove, making sure no sparks escaped the chimney. Someone always added one last log before bed, hoping it would burn long enough to keep the frost off their toes. The beds were simple but clever. A wooden frame stuffed with straw or feathers, topped with heavy quilts and whatever else could be found. Old coats, furs, sometimes even canvas from the wagon. Families shared beds because warmth was life. There wasn't any shame in it. Parents, children, even a guest passing through would squeeze together, listening to the wind like a lullaby. You could hear the cabin settle as everyone drifted off, wood creaking, the fire sighing. Outside, wolves howled from far away. The sound didn't scare people much, it was just part of the night. What frightened them more was silence, because silence meant snow was falling hard, and by morning they might wake up to find their door buried. Sometimes snow piled high enough that families had to shovel themselves out, digging little tunnels from the doorway to the woodpile. Still, they found ways to laugh about it. It was the frontier way. Humor as survival. The evenings were slow. There were no clocks to rush them. After supper, the family might sit close to the fire reading aloud from a Bible or an old newspaper. If someone had a fiddle, there might be music. Soft and slow, something to carry them into dreams. And when bedtime came, it wasn't like now. No brushing teeth with mint toothpaste or checking phones. They would quietly undress, fold their worn clothes, and crawl under the covers, pulling quilts up to their chin. The air was so cold that sometimes the moisture from their breath froze on the inside of the cabin walls. If you woke in the night, you'd see the faint red glow of the stove, the shapes of your family sleeping nearby, and maybe a dog curled at someone's feet. It was peaceful in its own rough way. For travelers or cowhands, sleep was harder. Out on the trail, the only roof was the sky. They'd dig small pits in the snow or huddle against rocks, wrapping themselves in blankets or buffalo hides. Horses stood nearby, breath steaming in the moonlight. Sometimes they built small fires, but not too close because sparks could set their blankets alight. There's a quiet strength in that kind of living, when the world outside could kill you, and yet you still lay down to rest. Every morning you woke up was a victory. Every night you survived was a small miracle. The Wild West was full of people who endured, not because they loved hardship, but because they refused to be broken by it. They learned to find beauty in the smallest comforts: a warm fire, a full belly, a roof that didn't leak. And maybe that's why, even today, we romanticize that world. It was hard, yes, brutally hard, but it was also honest. Every sunrise was earned. Every night's sleep was a reward. So tonight, as you listen, imagine lying on one of those simple beds, the quilts heavy on your chest, the fire crackling softly, the wind whispering outside. You can feel the faint warmth of the stove, smell the pine smoke in the air, and know that, at least for now, you're safe and the night will pass. Because no matter how cold it got, the people of the frontier always believed that morning would come, and it always did. The heart of every cabin, camp, or wagon was the fire. Without it, there was no warmth, no food, no comfort, just the deep, biting cold of the western winter. In a world where frost could sneak through walls and freeze water inside a cup overnight, the fire was more than a flame. It was life itself. Most families built their lives around that single glow. The fire wasn't just for cooking or heating. It was a quiet companion. People talked to it, tended to it like it was alive. You didn't let it die, not even for a few hours. Because in the wild, when your fire went out, sometimes so did your hope. But wood was precious. Gathering it wasn't easy when the land was frozen and hands were numb, so the people of the frontier became experts in stretching every ember, in finding clever ways to hold on to heat long after the flames died down. At night, when everyone was preparing for sleep, someone would bank the fire. That meant covering the glowing coals with ashes or dirt, trapping the warmth inside so it would smolder slowly through the night. In the morning, all it took was a gentle breath and a stick of kindling to bring the flames back to life. It was a delicate ritual, one that took practice and patience. A well-banked fire meant you wouldn't have to wake in the cold darkness to start from scratch. Still, even with the best care, the air inside the cabin could grow cold by midnight. So people found other tricks. One favorite was the hot stone method. They'd heat smooth rocks in the fire for an hour or two, then wrap them in cloth, old rags, or animal hides and place them under their bedding. The stones released warmth slowly, like nature's own heater. Sometimes they used bricks instead, or even iron tools, anything that could hold heat long enough to last until dawn. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. In wagon camps, when families traveled westward, hot coals were buried in small pits under their sleeping area. They'd spread a thin layer of dirt over them and lay their blankets above, careful not to burn themselves. The ground would stay warm for hours, making sleep just a little more bearable in the icy wind. Then there were the makeshift bed warmers, clever devices that looked like small metal pans on long handles. People filled them with embers or coals and slid them between the sheets to take the chill off before climbing in. They called them warming pans, and though they seem quaint now, they were treasured tools of survival. For travelers without homes, cowboys, trappers, or miners, the rules were different. They had to use what the land offered. Some built small reflector fires. 2 fires side by side with a wall of logs or stones behind one to bounce the heat toward them. Others dug shallow trenches to trap warmth and block the wind. A cowboy might curl up with his saddle as a pillow and his horse standing nearby, the animal's body heat mixing with his own beneath the starry sky. Out on the plains, you learned to appreciate every little thing that could keep the cold away, even a loyal animal's breath. In mining towns or makeshift camps, men sometimes shared tents or shanties, sleeping shoulder to shoulder in their clothes. They never undressed fully in winter. It was too dangerous. Boots stayed close to the fire because a frozen pair of shoes could ruin a man by morning. Even inside the towns, heat was a rare luxury. Coal and wood cost money. The rich might have large iron stoves or ornate fireplaces that stayed warm all night. But for most people, it was about cleverness and endurance, not comfort. When the nights grew harshest, when snow buried doors and frost crept across window panes, families huddled close. They made their own little world of warmth in a cold universe. Sometimes the parents would sleep on the outer sides of the bed, guarding the children in the middle. It wasn't just about body heat, it was about love, quiet and wordless, holding them all together through the dark. In the mornings, frost would sparkle on the walls like tiny diamonds. The water bucket might be frozen solid, but the coals would still glow faintly in the stove, waiting to be coaxed back to flame. Someone would blow gently, feed it a stick or two, and soon the cabin would fill again with that soft orange light. The sound of crackling wood, the smell of smoke, the promise of another day survived. It's strange to think how much care and time they gave to something we take for granted now. Today, we press a switch and warmth fills the room. Back then, every degree of heat was earned, through labor, through patience, through deep respect for nature's balance. For people of the frontier, fire wasn't a tool. It was a relationship. You tended to it, fed it, kept it alive, and in return, it kept you alive too. There's something beautifully human about that. A quiet understanding between light and darkness, between survival and surrender. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, think of those old cabins. The walls thin, the wind howling, but inside, a faint fire glows, defying the cold. You can almost hear the crackle, feel the slow warmth on your skin, smell the sweet wood smoke rising into the winter air. In that warmth, generations before us found peace. They learned that survival wasn't about strength alone, but about tenderness, the care you give to a flame, to a child, to yourself. And maybe that's why the fire still comforts us today. It reminds us that even in the coldest places, there's always something small and bright worth keeping alive. If fire was the heart of warmth in the Wild West, then clothing was its armor. Out there, the wind didn't just chill. It cut like a knife made of ice. The difference between life and death, between comfort and misery, often came down to what you had on your back. In the early days of the frontier, there were no stores waiting at the end of a long trail. No wool socks in neat packages or jackets lined with insulation. Every piece of clothing had to be made, traded, or repaired by hand. And when the winter came, people wrapped themselves not in fashion, but in whatever would keep them breathing through the coldest nights. The first settlers learned quickly from those who already knew the land, the Native American tribes who had lived with the seasons for generations. They understood how to use nature's gifts. Buffalo hides, tanned and softened, made cloaks warmer than anything woven. Deerskin was flexible, perfect for layering. Rabbit pelts were used for mittens and boots. Even small scraps of fur were sewn together, creating patchwork garments that trapped heat like a living blanket. A good winter outfit could weigh as much as a child. Layers upon layers. Shirts, vests, coats, wraps, until you could hardly move, but at least the cold stayed out. Wool was treasured when people could get it. It held warmth even when wet, something that saved countless lives when blizzards swept the plains. Imagine waking up before dawn in a small log cabin, your breath visible in the air. You pull on thick socks, maybe knitted by a wife or mother, then wrap a scarf or kerchief around your neck. The coat came next, heavy and smelling faintly of smoke and leather. If you were lucky enough to own one lined with fur, you'd feel that soft heat spreading through you, just enough to face the day. Cowboys, trappers, and travelers had their own kind of winter armor, a long oilskin coat to block the wind. Leather gloves, sometimes lined with wool, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to keep snow from their faces, and, beneath all of it, long underwear, thick, scratchy, but essential. Out on the range, warmth meant survival. Boots were another story altogether. The cold ground could steal warmth faster than the air, so people stuffed hay or dry grass inside their shoes to act as insulation. Others wrapped their feet in strips of fur or wore 2 pairs of socks when they could spare them. In deeper snow, some made makeshift snowshoes from branches, tying them with rope to spread their weight across the frozen drifts. Frontier women faced their own battle against the cold. Dresses weren't optional, even in the harshest winters, so they wore multiple layers: petticoats, wool skirts, shawls, and aprons. At night, they often slept in their clothes because undressing in a freezing cabin was simply too dangerous. Babies were swaddled in fur or wool blankets and sometimes slept in baskets near the stove, where the air was a little warmer. There was something deeply human about how these people adapted, turning the simplest materials into protection. They didn't need expensive fabrics or fashion trends. They just needed to stay alive. A farmer might wear the same coat for 20 winters, patching it until there was more thread than cloth. And still, they found beauty in it. A fur collar here, a colorful scarf there, a beaded trim sewn by hand. Even in the struggle for warmth, people held on to their sense of self, a reminder that life wasn't just about surviving, but about living with a little pride, even in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes neighbors helped each other. If someone's child had outgrown their coat, it was passed along to another family. Old blankets were cut into gloves. Furs were shared or traded for food. Community warmth was just as important as physical warmth, the kind of comfort that came from knowing you weren't alone. On especially cold nights, people prepared for bed like soldiers going into battle. They'd hang their coats near the stove to warm them, then crawl under piles of blankets and quilts. The last one to get into bed was always the unlucky one. The warmth had to be built up from scratch, and it took time before the chill left their bones. Even the air had a sound in winter, a quiet crackle when frost formed on windows, a soft hiss as the fire caught another log, and through it all the rustle of fabric, wool brushing wool, leather creaking softly, the sound of people wearing their warmth like armor against the endless cold. When dawn came, they'd rise slowly, reluctant to leave their cocoon of blankets. But duty didn't wait for comfort. Animals needed feeding, fires needed stoking, and water needed thawing. The moment a coat was thrown over shoulders, the day began. It's humbling to think of how much effort went into something we barely notice now. Warmth wasn't a switch to flip. It was a process, a way of life. It required attention, resourcefulness, and respect for the elements. And maybe that's what made those winters meaningful. They were reminders of how close humans live to the edge of nature, how fragile and strong we can be at the same time. Tonight, as you lie under your own blanket, think of those who came before. The men and women who faced howling blizzards wrapped in fur and wool, their hearts as steady as their fires. They didn't have much, but they had enough. The warmth they found wasn't just in their clothes, but in their determination, their families, and the small victories that came with every sunrise. And perhaps that's the greatest warmth of all, the kind that lives inside you, no matter how cold the world becomes. The frontier didn't end at the edge of a cabin. For every family who had walls around them, there were hundreds of others who had only the sky, cowboys, trappers, travelers, and dreamers moving across the wild land, chasing fortune, freedom, or sometimes just a place to rest. Out there, winter nights were endless. The stars burned sharp and cold, so bright they almost hurt to look at. The snow glowed pale blue under the moonlight, stretching across the plains like an ocean turned to ice. There was no sound but the wind and the slow breathing of horses. Imagine that silence, deep and alive. You can almost hear it, can't you? A lone rider finishes his supper by a fire, coffee steaming in a tin cup, his breath rising like smoke. He rolls out his blanket, tips his hat over his eyes, and lies back to face a sky bigger than anything he's ever known. It's beautiful, but it's also bitter. The cold doesn't care how brave you are. It creeps in slow, from your fingers, your toes, until it feels like the night itself wants to pull you under. So how did they do it? How did people sleep when the world was made of frost? They learned from experience and from mistakes. Cowboys carried heavy wool blankets, sometimes 2 or 3 rolled behind the saddle. Before bed, they'd search for shelter, a dip in the land, a line of trees, or the lee side of a hill to block the wind. Even a single rock outcrop could make the difference between freezing and sleeping through the night. They'd build small fires, not too large, just enough to give a little heat without attracting unwanted attention or burning through precious wood. Some dug shallow trenches in the snow, lined them with pine branches, then covered themselves with blankets and saddles. The snow acted like insulation, cold on the outside but trapping body heat within. The best trick of all was simple. Never sleep alone if you could help it. Travelers often shared fires, laying close enough for their blankets to overlap, body heat mixing under layers of wool and hide. It wasn't about comfort. It was survival. When the wind howled, they turned their backs to it, huddling tighter. Horses stood nearby, their breath steaming in the night air. Sometimes a man would lie near his horse just to feel that living warmth radiate through the cold ground. A loyal animal could mean the difference between waking up and never waking at all. Buffalo hides were prized above all else. Thick, heavy, and almost waterproof, they made perfect bedding. A cowboy could wrap himself completely, head to toe, like a cocoon. When the snow came down hard, he might wake buried under it, but alive. The snow, strangely enough, acted like a blanket, sealing in what little heat remained. Out in the mountains, trappers and hunters built what they called lean-tos, simple shelters made from branches, bark, and animal hides. A small fire in front, a wall of logs behind to reflect heat. They'd sleep with their feet toward the flames, turning through the night to warm each side in turn. If you fell asleep too close, you risked waking with singed boots or worse. and yet there was a strange kind of peace in those nights. Under the stars, the world felt ancient, raw, and pure. The cold made every sound sharper, every thought slower. You learned to listen. To the crackle of the fire, the pop of ice in the distance, the sigh of the wind as it moved through the grass. For those who lived that way, sleep wasn't about comfort. It was about trust. Trust that the fire would last, that the wind would ease, that morning would come. Every breath was a small victory, every dream a fragile escape from the hard beauty of the wilderness. Some nights, when the weather turned cruel, people didn't even try to sleep. They stayed up, feeding the fire, stamping their feet to keep the blood moving. They told stories, sang quietly, or just watched the stars shift across the sky. They said you could always tell a man's character by how he handled the cold. Some cursed it, fought it, wasted their strength. Others accepted it, made peace with it, and found a strange companionship in the quiet. Those were the ones who survived longest. Even in the harshest places there were moments of warmth that didn't come from fire. A shared cup of coffee, a laugh at something foolish, a song hummed softly into the night. The wild could be cruel, but it also had a way of reminding people what truly mattered: life, breath, and the fragile glow of human company in a frozen world. By dawn, the frost on their blankets would sparkle like tiny stars. The fire would be little more than ash. They'd shake off the snow, saddle up, and move on, their footprints soon erased by the wind. And maybe that was part of the magic of it. The fleeting, fragile nature of warmth in such a cold, wild land. It couldn't be stored. It couldn't be owned. You had to make it again each night with your hands, your breath, your will to keep going. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine lying under that vast sky, wrapped in blankets, your face turned toward the fire's glow. The air is cold, but the stars are endless. And for this one small moment, you are safe, warm, and completely at peace with the silence around you. The frontier was a hard place, but in its frozen stillness there was also something sacred, a reminder that even in the deepest cold, the human spirit can always find a little light. When the nights grew longer and colder, something beautiful began to happen on the frontier. The wind might roar outside, snow might pile up past the windows, and the world might seem like it had gone to sleep. But inside, the people of the Wild West came alive in quieter ways. The fire was the center of it all. It wasn't just for warmth, it was the heart of the home, the gathering place. Every evening, when the chores were done and the last log was thrown onto the flames, families drew close, not out of luxury, but out of love and necessity. Imagine the sound of that moment. The fire crackling softly, a kettle whistling faintly on the stove, the wind pressing against the walls but never quite finding its way inside, the air warm and smoky, filled with the scent of pine and stew. Parents sat near the hearth, mending clothes or carving small tools. Children, wrapped in blankets, their faces glowing in the firelight, listened to stories about home, or heroes, or maybe just what tomorrow's chores would bring. Sometimes it was completely quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because silence was its own kind of peace. They didn't have radios or record players. Entertainment came from each other. Someone might hum a tune or recite a poem half remembered from a book carried across the plains. A father would tell stories from his youth, his voice slow and steady, rising and falling like the rhythm of the flames. Those stories mattered. They weren't just to pass the time. They were a kind of warmth themselves. They reminded people who they were, and why they kept going, even when life seemed carved from ice. On the coldest nights, families sometimes stayed awake later, sitting as close to the fire as they dared. The flames became a kind of magic, something to watch, something to believe in. The sparks danced like little stars, and for a while the walls of the cabin felt like the whole world. Faith, too, was part of their survival. For many, the Bible sat right next to the fire poker, worn, read, and reread. In a land so wild and unforgiving, belief gave people courage. They prayed before bed, not for wealth or success, but simply for one more morning. Outside, the cold pressed harder. The wolves cried from the hills. But inside, the prayers were soft and steady, spoken by candlelight. Sometimes a mother would whisper them over her children as they slept, her words rising and falling with the wind. In towns or camps, faith took on other forms. Preachers traveled on horseback through the snow, visiting lonely homes to share sermons or songs. They called it firelight preaching, sitting by the hearth, reading from the scriptures while frost bloomed on the windows. Those moments weren't just religious. They were reminders that even in the farthest corners of the world, no one was truly forgotten. And when Christmas came, even the poorest cabins found a way to celebrate. Maybe it was just a pine branch hung near the door, or a single candle burning through the night. Maybe someone shared the last bit of sugar to bake a pie. Gifts were rare, but laughter was plentiful. For one night, the cold didn't matter. What mattered was togetherness, and the small joy of surviving another winter. Not every night was peaceful, of course. Tempers flared in close quarters. The long cold could wear down patience like water over stone. But still, families held on to one another. They had to. In a world where the snow could bury a cabin to its roof, love was as necessary as firewood. Sometimes, travelers who had lost their way would appear at a cabin door. They were always invited in, no questions asked. It was an unspoken rule of the frontier. No one was turned away on a winter night. There wasn't enough heat to waste on hate or suspicion. Everyone deserved a place by the fire. You could always tell when a stranger had come in from the cold. Their face red, their fingers stiff, their voice trembling from hours of wind. And yet, after a few minutes near the fire, after a cup of hot coffee or broth, color returned to their cheeks, and the cabin grew a little brighter for it. In those moments, warmth wasn't just something you felt on your skin. It was shared, passed from one heart to another, from one story to the next. That's what kept people alive in the Wild West winters. Not just fire, not just fur or faith, but connection. The sense that even in the loneliest, coldest place on earth, they were part of something bigger. When everyone finally went to bed, the fire was banked low, glowing softly like an ember heart. The wind still sang outside, brushing against the logs, testing the windows. But inside, the room was full of sleeping breaths, soft snores, and the invisible warmth of people who had made peace with the cold. They didn't dream of escaping the winter. They dreamed of enduring it, of seeing spring again, of watching the snow melt from the fields and the rivers break free from their ice. And somehow, every year, they did. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, imagine that same quiet warmth, the flicker of firelight on wooden walls, the sound of wind beyond the door, the feeling of being safe, surrounded by voices that care for you. That's what kept the frontier alive. Not just fire, but the light that lives inside us no matter how cold the world becomes. If you ever find yourself standing alone on a winter night in the open plains, you'll notice something. A sound that isn't quite sound at all. It's the voice of the wind, moving through grass, trees, and canyons, whispering across the frozen earth. In the Wild West, people used to say the wind carried stories, that it was the breath of the land itself, telling secrets only the lonely could hear. In those days, the wind wasn't background noise. It was a constant companion. It howled through cracks in cabin walls, slipped under doors, and brushed across sleeping faces. Some nights, it sang softly, like a lullaby. Other times, it screamed like a lost spirit, making the hair on your neck stand up. The sound of it could be both comforting and terrifying, depending on how much wood you had left for the fire. Travelers often spoke of the wind as if it were alive. Cowboys riding the range learned to read it, to tell when a storm was coming just by the way the air shifted. A low hum in the distance meant snow was on the way. A sudden, sharp gust meant the weather was turning. The wind didn't lie. It told them what was coming long before the sky did. But when night fell and you were alone under the stars, it felt different. the wind became a presence, invisible, endless, filling the silence between your thoughts. It carried the creak of old trees, the snap of frozen branches, the faint rattle of loose shutters. Even when everything else slept, the wind never did. Inside the cabins, people grew used to it. They learned its moods. They'd say, "That's a north wind tonight," or "The snow's coming heavy." The sound seeped into their dreams, a steady reminder of the world outside, wild, untamed, always moving. For children, it sometimes felt like the voice of something ancient, something watching over them while they slept. And in a way, maybe it was. Because out there, in the vast emptiness, you could start to believe that the world was alive, that every gust of wind and drift of snow was part of something greater. The settlers might not have had much time for poetry, but they felt it all the same. The land spoke to them through sound and silence. When blizzards came, the wind turned violent, a roar that shook walls and made even the strongest hearts tremble. The world disappeared in white. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. All you could hear was that unending, furious rush. In those moments, people huddled close, hands clasped, praying the roof would hold, the fire would stay lit, and morning would come again. Sometimes the wind would last for days. You couldn't work, couldn't travel, couldn't even think straight. The sound filled your head until it felt like it was inside you. That was when people told stories, to drown out the noise or to make peace with it. A story could turn fear into something familiar. Cowboys out on the trail had their own way of listening. Lying under the stars, they'd hear the wind move over the prairie like a tide. Some swore it carried voices, laughter, music, even whispers from home. Others said it was just the earth breathing, keeping watch while men slept. It's strange how, after a while, you stop fighting the sound. You start to hear its patterns, its rhythm, the pauses between gusts, the soft hum before it rises again. It becomes part of you, a heartbeat of the land. And in that strange, endless noise, you can find a kind of peace. Frontier poets and preachers sometimes wrote about the wind as a messenger from God, unseen but powerful, reminding man of his smallness. The idea wasn't far-fetched. When you stood out there surrounded by nothing but snow and sky, it was impossible not to feel humbled. The wind could strip a man to the bone, but it could also remind him that he was alive. Even indoors, when the fire crackled and the family gathered close, the wind remained a presence, a reminder of everything beyond those thin wooden walls. It sang in the chimney, whistled at the window panes, and pressed against the roof. The sound was never quite gone, only softened by laughter and song. Some said that the wind made the frontier people stronger. You had to live with something that never stopped. You learned patience, you learned silence, and maybe you even learned how to listen, really listen, to what the world was saying. Because in the quiet between gusts, when the fire was low and the night stretched on, there was something beautiful in that stillness, a feeling that you were part of something ancient and vast, a reminder that the same wind had touched the mountains, the forests, the rivers. And now, gently, it brushed across your own face. People learned to find comfort in it, to let it lull them to sleep, to let it remind them that even when everything felt frozen and still, life was still moving, somewhere out there. So, as you lie in bed tonight, imagine that wind, soft, endless, moving through the world. Maybe it carries the scent of pine, or the faint echo of a cowboy's song from long ago. Maybe it's just the quiet hum of nature keeping watch while you rest. Either way, it's there, a timeless companion, whispering to those who listen. The same wind that brushed the faces of settlers and dreamers, now drifting gently past your window too. Let it be your lullaby tonight, the sound of the world breathing, softly, endlessly, through the dark. There came a point every winter when the cold grew so deep it felt like time itself had stopped. The wind calmed, the snow settled, and the rivers, those living veins of the land, turned to glass. The people of the frontier used to say that was when the earth held its breath. When the river froze, everything changed. For those who lived near water, the river wasn't just scenery, it was life. It was where they drew water for cooking and cleaning, where they washed clothes, where animals came to drink. When it froze over, that simple rhythm of daily living broke. Suddenly, every drop of water became something you had to fight for. Men would walk to the banks with axes, breaking holes in the thick ice to scoop water into buckets. The air was so cold that the edges of those holes froze again within minutes, sealing themselves shut as if the river didn't want to be disturbed. Sometimes you'd hear it groan, deep, low, almost alive, the sound of pressure building beneath the surface. The ice was beautiful, though. When the sunlight hit it, it shimmered in pale blues and silvers, stretching for miles. It looked peaceful, almost holy, but everyone knew how dangerous it could be. One wrong step and the surface could crack beneath your feet, the water below waiting cold and silent. There were stories, whispered more than told, of people who vanished under the ice, never to be seen again until spring thawed them free. Still, life had to go on. Animals needed water, fires needed tending, and families needed food. Fishing through the ice was possible if you were patient enough. Men would cut square holes, set their lines, and wait, breath turning white in the air. The quiet was absolute. No sound but the distant creak of the frozen current beneath them. Catching a fish in that stillness felt like a small miracle. Travelers learned to use frozen rivers as roads. Once solid, the ice could bear the weight of horses and wagons, letting people cross places that had been impassable just months before. But every step carried risk. The ice changed daily, thicker in some spots, treacherous in others. You learned to listen to it, to feel the faint tremor beneath your boots. Some nights, under a full moon, the surface would sing, a strange, echoing hum as cracks formed deep below. It was eerie but beautiful, like the earth playing its own frozen song. Inside the cabins, people spoke of the river like an old friend who had fallen asleep. They missed its sound, the steady trickle and splash that had filled their summers. The silence of winter was comforting at times, but also heavy. The stillness pressed in, and you began to long for motion, for the sense that the world was still alive. To make up for it, families found new rhythms. They melted snow for water, saving every drop like treasure. Children would bring in handfuls of clean snow in buckets, laughing as their cold fingers stung. Mothers stirred pots over the fire, the steam rising like mist over a hidden lake. Life became smaller, slower, but somehow deeper too. There was something humbling about living through a frozen river season. It reminded people how fragile their comfort was, how quickly nature could change everything. But it also reminded them of their strength. Every task, no matter how small, became an act of defiance against the cold. Breaking ice, melting snow, feeding animals, each was a promise to keep going. And when the nights were long and the wind quieted, some would walk down to the frozen banks just to look. The moonlight on the ice turned the world silver. Trees stood like black lines against the sky, their branches glittering with frost. You could see your breath, hear your heartbeat, and for a moment it felt like standing at the edge of eternity. Underneath that ice, the river never really stopped. It moved slowly, secretly, carrying the memory of warmer days. People like to think of it that way. Not dead, just resting, waiting. That thought helped them sleep better, because if the river was only sleeping, then spring would surely come. When it finally did, it arrived quietly at first. A crack here, a drip there. The ice softened, turned cloudy, then darkened as water began to show through. Soon the sound returned. Faint, then stronger. A trickle, then a rush. The frozen world stirred, and the river began to sing again. The first morning, someone heard that sound, the song of running water. They'd tell everyone. It spread through cabins and camps like good news. The river's awake, they'd say. Winter's ending. and for the first time in months, people stepped outside not to battle the cold, but to breathe, to listen, to smile. It's easy now, sitting in warmth, to forget how much the river meant to them. But out there, in a world ruled by weather and survival, it was everything. Water, food, direction, life. When it froze, time stood still. When it thawed, hope returned. So, tonight, as you listen to the quiet, imagine that frozen world. A white horizon, a sleeping river, and a cabin glowing with firelight nearby. Everything is still, waiting for the sound of spring. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, you can hear it too. A soft cracking somewhere deep inside the ice, the slow, patient rhythm of life finding its way back. If you lived long enough on the frontier, you learned something important. Snow wasn't just snow. It had moods, voices, and a kind of wisdom. It could tell you when to travel and when to stay put, when a storm was brewing, and when the air would finally soften into spring. The people who survived the Wild West winters didn't fight the snow. They listened to it. The first snowfall always came with a hush. It was like the world taking a deep breath, then holding it. The sounds of life, horses, wind, water, all grew muffled, tucked beneath a soft white blanket. For settlers, that silence was both beautiful and eerie. It made the world feel new again, untouched and holy. Children would rush outside to catch flakes on their tongues, laughing as they melted instantly, unaware that soon this same beauty would test them harder than anything else. Frontier folk came to understand snow in ways that modern people might not believe. They knew the difference between a wet snow that packed tightly underfoot and a dry one that blew like sand. They could tell from its color if the weather would hold. A blue-gray snow meant more storms, while a blinding white usually meant clear skies to follow. The way snow crunched beneath your boots could tell you how cold the night would be. Hunters and trappers especially learned to read it like a map. Every animal left its signature. The round prints of a rabbit, the deep pads of a wolf, the straight trail of a deer. They could tell how long ago a creature had passed just by the way the edges of its tracks softened. The snow carried secrets for anyone who paid attention. But it wasn't only tracks they read. They listened to the sound snow made when falling. A soft whisper meant light flakes. Easy to shovel, gentle to walk through. But when the flakes fell heavy and fast, thick enough to blur the horizon, people knew to hurry home. The snow had a way of sneaking up on you, turning the world into a blinding white maze. In the high plains, the snow could bury fences, doors, even entire cabins. The drifts would climb until windows vanished under white walls. Families learned to dig tunnels out from their doors, shaping paths just high enough to crawl through. Children turned them into games. Tunnels of adventure. But for the parents, they were lifelines. And yet, in the midst of hardship, there was beauty. On clear nights when the moon shone on fresh snow, the whole world glowed blue. It wasn't the cold blue of ice, but a soft, living color that shimmered like silk. People used to step outside just to watch it, their breath curling into the light, the snow reflecting stars like tiny diamonds. In those moments, even the toughest frontiersmen could fall silent, humbled by the quiet glory of nature. Snow also carried sound differently. When it was deep and fresh, footsteps vanished almost instantly. Voices seemed to float instead of echoing. Some said that's why the winters felt so lonely. Even your own words didn't come back to you. Others thought of it as peace, a rare kind of silence that reminded you how small you were in such a vast, white world. For travelers, snow was both friend and foe. It covered the rough ground, making travel smoother by sleigh or horse, but it also hid danger. Thin ice, holes, or snakes frozen stiff in their dens. A misstep could mean disaster. Many learned to trust their horses more than their own eyes. The animals could sense where the ground was safe. Some nights during blizzards, people swore they could hear voices in the wind. Laughter, whispers, cries for help. It wasn't madness. The sound of wind moving over uneven snow could mimic human tones, rising and falling like distant speech. Those who survived the harshest winters said it wasn't ghosts you were hearing. It was the snow itself, talking. Inside, people learned to work with what the snow gave them. They used it to insulate their cabins, packing it around the base of walls to keep the cold out. They stored blocks of it in cellars to preserve food through spring. And they melted it, endless buckets of it, to drink, wash, and cook. The act of melting snow became a rhythm of life, a quiet meditation. You learned to wait, to be patient, as the frozen white turned slowly into water over the fire. There was poetry in the way snow changed the world. Every landmark became softer, rounder. Sharp edges disappeared. The world looked innocent again, as if it had forgotten its hardships. But those who had lived long enough knew better. The snow was beautiful, yes, but also a teacher. It taught humility, patience, and respect. It reminded people that they were guests in a land much older and stronger than themselves. By late winter, when the snow began to harden under the sun, a new sound filled the air. The slow, rhythmic drip of melting ice. It was the sweetest sound of all. You'd hear it on the roof first, then in the trees, then down by the frozen creeks. The snow was beginning to speak in a new language, one of ending, of change. It said, "Hold on a little longer. Spring is coming." And so they did. They held on. Even now, when we watch snow fall from a warm window, we can feel a trace of what they felt, that mix of awe and fear, beauty and burden. Snow still carries that same message, the same whisper from the old frontier. Slow down, listen, and endure. Because the snow has always known more than it tells. It remembers every step, every fire, every silent night where someone sat by the window and watched it fall, wondering how something so cold could make the world feel so calm. Out in the frozen stillness of the Wild West, people like to say that no one was ever truly alone. Even in the coldest months, when snow buried the ground and rivers slept beneath the ice, life still lingered, quietly, watchfully, surviving in the shadows. These were the winter visitors, the uninvited guests of the frontier, who slipped through the night when humans were warm by their fires. You could always tell when something had come by. In the morning, before the first rays of sun melted the frost, fresh tracks would appear around cabins and barns. Paw prints, hoof marks, the soft trails of rabbits. Sometimes claw marks on a wooden post. The snow told all their stories. Coyotes were the most common visitors. You could hear them long before you ever saw them. Their howls carried across miles, sharp, mournful, rising and falling like a strange kind of music. To some, it was eerie, a reminder of how wild and vast the land truly was. But to others, it was comforting, a sign that the world outside the cabin walls was still alive. At night, when the moonlight spilled across the snow, you might see their shadows moving near the tree line, lean bodies gliding between light and dark. They weren't looking for trouble, just food, just warmth. Sometimes they'd dig near barns, hoping for scraps or a small animal caught unaware. And though farmers chased them off, part of them admired the coyotes' resilience. Out there, everything fought to survive, and nothing gave up easily. Then there were the deer, gentle, ghostly figures that appeared at dawn or dusk. They'd move silently through the frost, noses to the ground, searching for bark or dry grass. Their breath rose in clouds, and when they lifted their heads, their dark eyes caught the faintest glint of firelight from the cabins. Children loved them. They'd whisper about the deer as if they were spirits, guardians of the forest come to visit. Sometimes a family would leave out a handful of grain or dried apples by the edge of the woods, just to see the delicate prints appear the next morning. But not every visitor was peaceful. When food ran scarce, wolves came down from the hills. People said you could sense their presence before you heard them. The silence grew heavier, the horses restless. Then the howls began, deep and long, echoing through the frozen dark. Farmers would double-check their doors and bring the livestock closer to the cabin. The wolves rarely attacked humans, but their hunger made them bold. Still, even they had a strange beauty to them. On clear nights, when the moon lit the snow like silver, you could see a pack moving in perfect rhythm, shadows gliding across the white field, wildness in its purest form. To the settlers, it was terrifying and majestic all at once. It reminded them that they were not the masters of this land. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Smaller creatures also made their rounds. Foxes darted near chicken coops, clever and silent. Their red fur looked almost golden under the firelight. Sometimes you'd find their prints circling a cabin, leading off toward the woods again. Owls sat on fence posts, motionless except for the blink of pale eyes. Their low hoots rolled softly through the air, blending with the crackle of distant fires. Inside, families learned to listen. They could tell who was outside just by sound, the scrape of claws on frozen ground, the flutter of wings, the distant bark of a coyote. To someone from the city, it might have seemed frightening, but to the people of the frontier, it was the rhythm of winter. The wilderness wasn't an enemy, it was a neighbor. Sometimes even the animals seemed to grow curious about the humans. There were stories of wild horses that would come close during snowstorms, standing near barns just to share the heat. Bears, before their long sleep, would pass by cabins, sniffing the smoke in the air, leaving deep prints as they lumbered away. Raccoons would sneak onto porches to steal leftovers left to freeze. It was a strange coexistence, cautious but shared. Children, especially, were fascinated. They'd press their faces against frosted windows, eyes wide, trying to spot movement outside. When they saw something, even just a bird hopping between branches, they'd whisper excitedly to their parents. In the long, quiet months, those small encounters felt like magic. The world outside wasn't empty. It was alive, just slower, softer. When the snowstorms came, the animals disappeared, and the silence deepened. That's when people missed them most. The familiar sounds of paws, wings, and cries replaced by the steady roar of wind. It made you realize how much you'd come to depend on their presence, even the dangerous ones. They were reminders that you weren't alone in this frozen world. And when the storm passed and the sky cleared to reveal 1,000 bright stars, the tracks would return. Fresh lines etched in the snow. Proof that life had endured once again. There was one old settler woman, people said, who used to feed the birds every morning, no matter how cold it was. Even when the snow came up to her knees, she'd go outside with a small cup of seeds and scatter them on the frozen ground. "They're hungry, same as us," she'd say. And soon enough the air would fill with wings, sparrows, blackbirds, finches, flashes of color against the endless white. Her cabin became a small sanctuary in the wilderness, and every spring when the snow melted and the world came alive again, the birds returned. Maybe they remembered her kindness. Maybe, like her, they simply loved the sound of life returning. That was how people in the Wild West lived, side by side with nature, respecting its balance. The animals came and went, the snow fell and melted, and through it all, both man and beast learned the same quiet lesson: to keep moving, to keep breathing, to keep watching the horizon for light. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that silent winter landscape, a warm cabin glowing in the dark, and just beyond it, soft footprints crossing the snow. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote calls, a deer steps lightly, and an owl watches from above. Everything is still, but not empty. Everything sleeps, but nothing is gone. The world rests, waiting for dawn. Long before electricity, before thermostats or heaters, warmth wasn't something you switched on. It was something you earned. Out there in the Wild West, when winter wrapped the world in silence and snow, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about keeping your spirit lit, like a small fire that refused to die. Inside the cabins, warmth began with the fire, of course. It was the heartbeat of every home. Someone always had to tend it, adding logs, shaking ashes, poking at coals until they glowed red again. But it wasn't only heat that it gave. The fire was company. It flickered, it whispered, it moved. It filled the room with a soft orange glow that made even rough wooden walls seem cozy. People gathered around it naturally. The youngest children sprawled closest, cheeks flushed and sleepy. Mothers sat nearby, sewing or mending, the needle glinting in the firelight. Fathers carved tools, polished rifles, or told stories that began slow and ended with a laugh. There wasn't much to do in those long dark months, so talking, really talking, became its own kind of warmth. Stories were the secret weapon against winter. They passed the hours, filled the silence, and reminded everyone who they were. Old tales of the frontier, ghost stories whispered in the glow, memories of summers past. They became threads that stitched people together. Sometimes a traveler would stop by, shivering and half frozen, and before long, they'd be pulled into the circle, sharing a tale of their own. And always there was food. Simple, heavy food meant to stick to your ribs. Stews thick with potatoes, beans, and salted meat. Bread baked in iron pots. Coffee boiled so strong it could keep you awake through a blizzard. The smell alone felt like comfort. Some nights, that was the highlight. Not a feast, but a shared meal in a warm room. The storm howling outside while spoons clinked softly against bowls. But the real warmth wasn't in the fire or the food. It was in the people, in how they leaned on each other. When the nights stretched long and the wind found every crack in the cabin walls, people relied on company more than anything else. Families huddled under shared blankets. Neighbors checked on each other after storms, trudging through snowdrifts just to make sure someone else's chimney was still smoking. There was a quiet code among frontier folk, an understanding that no one survived alone. If you had firewood to spare, you shared it. If a family lost their roof to snow, others helped patch it. If someone was sick, another family might take turns sitting with them through the night. It wasn't charity, it was life. Children learned this early. They saw their parents' faces by firelight, tired, lined with worry, but always gentle. They learned that courage didn't mean fearlessness. It meant carrying on, even when everything around you was frozen. Some nights, when the wind died down, the world outside turned still as a painting. You could hear the faint hiss of the fire, the quiet breathing of sleeping children, maybe the slow creak of snow sliding off the roof. Those moments had a magic to them, as if the whole frontier was holding its breath. People would sit awake, half listening, half dreaming, thinking about the days when grass would grow again. And though winters were brutal, people found joy in small ways. They made games from nothing, guessing the shapes of frost on windows, playing cards by lantern light, telling riddles, or simply laughing at how their boots froze stiff overnight. The human heart, it seemed, had its own kind of insulation. Sometimes visitors from nearby cabins would bring music. Someone would carry a fiddle wrapped in cloth or a harmonica tucked in a pocket. The tunes were slow and sweet, songs from home, from places far away. You could almost forget the cold when music filled the air. Even if the fingers were numb and the strings went out of tune, no one cared. It wasn't about perfection. It was about warmth that reached deeper than any fire could. For those who lived alone, trappers, hunters, widowers, warmth took other forms. Some talked to their animals. Some spoke aloud to the fire. Some carved small wooden figures or wrote in worn notebooks. Loneliness was a kind of cold, too, and each person found their own way to keep it from creeping in. In the end, what truly kept people alive in those winters wasn't just skill or toughness. It was tenderness. The quiet care of a mother wrapping her child in an extra quilt. The sound of neighbors calling out across the snow. The shared silence between two people sitting by the fire saying nothing but understanding everything. It's easy to think of the Wild West as a place of grit and danger. And it was. But beneath that, it was also full of deep warmth. Not the kind that melts snow, but the kind that keeps hearts from freezing. And maybe that is the real secret of survival out there. They didn't just fight the cold. They built warmth from the inside out, through kindness, patience, laughter, and the steady belief that even the longest winter would pass. So tonight, as you lie under your own blankets, think of them, those quiet souls who lived by the firelight, their faces soft in the glow, their breath rising in the dark. Outside, the world was ice and silence. Inside, it was stories and heartbeats. And maybe that's all warmth really is. The small, steady light we carry through the cold, trusting it will be enough until morning. No one ever knew exactly when it would happen. It didn't come with fanfare or color, just a feeling. A slight softness in the air, a shift in the sound of the wind, a hint that the world was ready to move again. After months of white silence, the thaw began. At first, it was just small things. The icicles hanging from the roof started dripping, slow and steady, like a clock counting down. Snow that had sat for weeks without changing began to sag at the edges. The hard crust softened, and your boots sank a little deeper each day. The air smelled different too, less sharp, more alive. It carried the faint scent of wet earth, pine, and wood smoke. People noticed before they said anything. They'd step outside in the morning, take a deep breath, and just listen. Somewhere, far away, they might hear water. Real, running water, a sound so ordinary in summer, but now it made their hearts lift. The rivers were waking up. Beneath the thinning ice, the current began to push again, slow at first, then stronger. Inside the cabins, you could feel the difference even before the fire burned out. The cold wasn't as deep anymore. The frost on the windows melted by midday instead of lasting until night. Children started leaving the door open a little longer, and no one scolded them. Dogs stretched out in patches of sunlight that lasted a little longer each day. It wasn't spring yet, not quite. The snow still fell sometimes, but it didn't stay. The ground below it was softening, drinking it in like a long, slow sip. Farmers watched it closely. They'd touch the soil, feel the dampness with their fingertips, and smile. Soon, they'd start again. For the women, the thaw meant work. Heavy blankets were aired out and beaten clean. The stoves were scrubbed, the windows wiped clear. Everything smelled of soap, smoke, and melting snow. It was the season of preparation, a time to turn from surviving to living. For months, everyone had lived in the same dim rhythm. Stoke the fire, melt the snow, eat, sleep, repeat. Now, the days began to stretch, and people found themselves staying up later, sitting by the fire not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Someone might hum a song again, or open the door just to feel the fresh air on their face. When the rivers broke free, it was like a celebration. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the valleys. A deep groan followed by rushing water. It was loud, chaotic, and beautiful. People would stand by the banks and watch the last slabs of ice drift downstream. Children laughed and threw sticks into the water, racing them as the current carried them away. The birds came back next. Tiny flashes of movement in the trees, quick chirps that filled the silence. You could almost feel the land exhaling. Even the animals that had hidden all winter began to stir. Deer moving closer to the open fields, rabbits hopping through the wet grass, bears stirring in their dens. For the people, it was a time of gratitude. Every winter took something. A few animals, some supplies, sometimes even neighbors. To see another thaw meant you had made it. You'd beaten the cold again. The thaw wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. People started talking more, laughing more. They visited each other's cabins again, bringing small gifts, a jar of syrup, a piece of dried meat, a smile. The long silence of winter had been broken, and words flowed again as easily as the melting snow. One old farmer used to say, "The earth never forgets how to live," and he was right. No matter how deep the freeze, the grass always found a way to push through. The same was true for the people. They had been quiet and patient, but never defeated. As the days passed, the color began to return. The snow turned patchy, revealing hints of brown and green beneath. The sky deepened to a brighter blue. When the first rain fell, it didn't freeze. It soaked into the ground, loosening it for new roots. The sound of it on the cabin roofs was soft and rhythmic, almost musical. After months of wind and silence, rain felt like kindness. Nights were still cold, but they carried a different feeling now. Instead of biting, the chill felt clean, gentle. You could hear frogs beginning to croak again in distant ponds, and sometimes the faint buzz of insects stirring too early. Life was returning, quietly and steadily. And in the still moments, when the fire burned low and the air smelled of thawed earth and damp wood, people would think about what they had endured. The storms, the hunger, the loneliness. It all seemed far away now, like a bad dream. What remained was gratitude, deep and wordless. Some settlers kept small traditions to honor the thaw. They'd light one last winter fire, burning whatever scraps were left, broken handles, old straw, bits of fabric, to mark the end of the season. Families would gather around it, not in silence, but in laughter. They'd tell stories of the coldest nights, the strangest dreams, the moments they almost gave up but didn't. And as the fire burned down to embers, they'd look out at the melting snow and know that, once again, they had won. Out on the plains, the sun began to climb higher, glowing gold on the horizon. The ice sparkled, then dripped, then disappeared. Smoke rose from chimneys again, not as a plea for warmth, but as a sign of life. The thaw was more than just a season. It was a promise kept. The world always came back. The rivers always ran again. The people always endured. So, as you lie here tonight, imagine the sound of dripping water outside a cabin window, the soft patter of melting snow. Feel the air, cool but no longer cruel. Hear the gentle creak of the thawing earth beneath your feet, and know, as the frontier folk once did, that no winter lasts forever. Because every cold night, no matter how endless it seems, eventually gives way to warmth. And every frozen world remembers how to wake. After months of white silence, the day arrived so quietly that many didn't notice it at first. The snow had been retreating for weeks, little by little, but now, suddenly, the world had changed. The air carried warmth again. The sky, no longer pale and distant, shone in a clear, brilliant blue. Spring had finally come to the Wild West. It didn't arrive in a rush. It came in whispers, a bird's song outside the cabin, a drop of water gliding down a tree trunk, the smell of thawed earth mixed with wood smoke. For so long, people had only known the cold. They almost didn't trust this softness at first, but it was real. The long sleep was over. The first true sign of spring was sound. The world that had been hushed for months began to hum again. Streams trickled. Branches creaked in the breeze. Horses snorted in open pens, eager to stretch their legs. Birds filled the sky with notes that sounded like laughter. The quiet land, once frozen and gray, was waking up. Families came outside more often now, not bundled in thick furs but in lighter coats, smiling in the sunlight. Faces that had spent months in the flicker of firelight now glowed with the real warmth of the sun. Children ran in the melting fields, boots splashing in puddles, their laughter echoing against the hills. The sound of life returned. Cattle were led out from the barns, their breath still visible in the cool air. They lowered their heads to sniff at the ground, as if surprised to find it real again. The smell of grass, faint but growing stronger each day, filled the plains. In the evenings, the cabins no longer burned so hot. Fires became smaller, their light softer. Windows were cracked open just a little to let in the smell of pine and wet soil. It was a different kind of warmth now. Not the desperate heat of survival, but the gentle comfort of beginning again. Neighbors visited more often. After months of isolation, people walked the muddy paths between homesteads, sharing small stories and big smiles. "You made it through," they'd say. And that simple sentence meant everything. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a recognition. Everyone who stood there had faced the same storms, the same hunger, the same lonely nights. They had endured. It was also a time of remembering. Some cabins were quiet, missing the ones who hadn't seen the thaw, but even then, the living carried on in their honor, planting new crops, mending roofs, tending to the animals. Life was a circle, and spring was its gentle reminder. When the first flowers appeared, it almost seemed impossible. Tiny, stubborn bursts of color, yellow, purple, white, pushing up through the last patches of snow. Children would pick them and bring them home proudly, their fingers muddy and cold. Mothers would place them in little jars by the window, where they caught the sunlight and swayed in the breeze. The land itself seemed to sigh with relief. The rivers ran fast and clear, carrying away the last memories of ice. Hills turned green again, soft and alive. Even the wind felt different, no longer sharp but warm, carrying the scent of rain and open fields. People worked from dawn to dusk again, but this work was joyful. The men mended fences, planted seeds, built new sheds. The women washed, cooked, and laughed while hanging clothes that finally dried in the sun. Life found rhythm again, a rhythm of light, movement, and renewal. And at night, when the stars appeared, they looked closer than before, their reflection dancing in puddles and rivers. Around small fires, people told stories not of ghosts or hunger anymore, but of plans, of what they would build, of where they would travel, of the next summer's harvest. Hope had returned, not as a dream, but as something they could touch. Even the animals seemed lighter. Birds chased each other through the trees. Foxes darted through tall grass, and horses ran freely, their manes glinting gold in the morning sun. The wilderness, once fierce and merciless, had softened. For a brief moment, man and nature seemed to breathe in unison. And yet, people didn't forget. The cold was a teacher. Every creak of the cabin walls, every night spent huddled close to the fire, had reminded them how fragile and precious life could be. Spring didn't erase the winter, it gave it meaning. Without the struggle, this warmth would have felt empty. When the first night without frost came, people noticed. They left their doors open for a while, listening to the sounds outside, the croak of frogs, the rush of distant rivers, the gentle rustle of trees. The cold was gone, but its memory lingered, shaping their gratitude into something deeper than joy. Some old-timers liked to sit on their porches and watch the horizon, sipping coffee or whiskey, smiling to themselves. "Another one over," they'd murmur. And that was enough, because in the end, survival wasn't about strength or luck. It was about patience, the quiet, steady kind that holds on through every storm, trusting that warmth will come again. And it always did. So, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that world. The first spring after a long, hard winter. The fields glistening under the morning sun, the air full of birdsong, the sound of rivers running free again, the cabins standing strong, their chimneys smoking gently. And inside, the people, tired, smiling, alive, watching the dawn through open windows, feeling the warmth on their faces, and knowing that life, once again, had begun anew. The Wild West may have been harsh, but it also held beauty that few will ever know. The beauty of survival, of simplicity, and of finding peace in the smallest signs of life. And maybe, as you close your eyes tonight, that's a comfort you can carry too. No matter how long the winter lasts, spring always finds its way home. And so, our journey through the Wild West winter comes to a peaceful close. We've walked through storms that froze the plains, through nights where firelight was the only sun, and through moments where silence stretched wider than the sky. But we've also seen warmth, the kind that lived not in flames or blankets, but in hearts that refused to give up. The people who faced those winters weren't legends or heroes. They were ordinary souls with rough hands, patient eyes, and quiet strength. They woke before dawn, carried wood through snow, shared bread and laughter when there wasn't much of either. They learned that survival wasn't about fighting nature, but learning to live alongside it, to move with its seasons, to listen to its silence. When the thaw came, it didn't just melt the snow. It melted the fear, the loneliness, the long-held breath of winter. The sound of dripping water was more than just a sign of spring. It was a song of life returning, a promise that even the coldest nights eventually end. Maybe that's the story hidden inside every winter, that endurance, kindness, and hope can outlast even the deepest freeze. The Wild West was just a land of hardship. It was a land of quiet miracles, where warmth began in the smallest places. So, as you lie here, wrapped in your own kind of warmth, think of those cabins on the prairie, their fires glowing softly, their people resting at last. Outside, the wind has stopped. The stars stretch endless and clear, and inside someone whispers, "We made it." Let that thought stay with you tonight. The world turns, the seasons change, and no winter lasts forever. Sleep well, traveler, and may the warmth of their courage and the peace of spring's return carry you gently into dreams.